Yesterday, the Deputy First Minister said claims by trade unions about the number of job losses that will result from the SNP's budget cuts were utterly exaggerated. Does the First Minister agree with her Deputy?
First Minister.
Given we're on the issue of claims, and I'm glad we are, because...
Order.
Because can I say, first of all, that any job losses in any sector are a matter of regret. That's why this government has a policy of no compulsory redundancies. John Swinney did get something wrong in the chamber yesterday. He said that on the most recent figures, employment in the devolved public sector had gone down by 500. I have to tell the Deputy First Minister that was a misreading of the statistics. Employment in the devolved public sector, according to the most recent statistics, has gone up by 500. But the reason I think it's important to treat these issues seriously and not be irresponsible in exaggerating is illustrated by something Kezia Dugdale said in this chamber yesterday. She said, and it was repeated by Jackie Baillie later on, that Clackmannanshire Council was going to reduce the number of jobs by 350. Now, that is a puzzling claim, because Clackmannanshire Council's budget was actually set the day before yesterday, and the actual number is less than a third of the one that Kezia Dugdale cited in this chamber. So these are
Order. Let's hear the First Minister.
These are important matters, Presiding Officer. This is not an easy time for councils or for the public sector, but I don't think any of this is helped by wild scaremongering on the part of Labour that is more about their own desperate fight for survival than it is about anything else.
Kezia Dugdale. Ms Dugdale.
She calls it wild scaremongering. Here's Willie McGonigal from Unite. We've lost 40,000 local government jobs since 2010, and over the next year we will likely lose a further 15,000 as a result of Scottish Government cuts. He goes on to say, to suggest that the budget cuts will have a minimal impact on jobs or services is frankly astounding. Not my words, First Minister, the words of a leading trade union in this country. And the casual disregard with which John Swinney dismissed those who are losing their jobs left many workers sick to their stomach yesterday. And to hear the First Minister back him up is even worse, because despite the pretence from the government, the reality is that cuts are happening all across the country because of a choice that the SNP made. And SNP-controlled councils this week passed plans to cut the number of staff in their schools. Now the First Minister disagrees with the trade unions and the workers about the number of job losses. So can she tell us how many jobs does she think will be lost as a result of the SNP budget?
Well, I've just pointed out that Kezia Dugdale in this chamber yesterday exaggerated the impact in one council by a factor of 3. The figures she has just quoted are simply not borne out by the reality of council budgets. Let me quote, for example, Aberdeenshire Council, where Labour is part of the administration. There will be a minimal impact on jobs. Argyll and Bute Council, we are doing all possible to keep the impact on jobs to a minimum. Aberdeen City Council, where Labour is in administration, we are not looking at job cuts. Now, Kezia Dugdale has been caught red-handed exaggerating the position in Clackmannanshire Council. But this is important, Presiding Officer, because these are serious issues and they deserve to be treated seriously. At the last session of First Minister's questions, Kezia Dugdale stood up and said that Perth and Kinross Council were going to cut childcare, we're going to cut additional support needs, we're going to cut early years teachers and we're going to cut maths and English teachers. Perth and Kinross Council set its budget later that same day, and they agreed a budget for 2016-17 that has no reductions in early years teachers, no reductions in childcare. It maintains teacher numbers, and actually their budget doesn't cut additional support needs. It increased the additional support need budget by 6%. So there is a gulf here, Presiding Officer, between what Labour say in this chamber and the reality of what is happening across the country. So before we go any further with any more claims from Labour, I wonder if Kezia Dugdale will take the opportunity to retract what she said yesterday about Clackmannanshire and to retract what she said 2 weeks ago about Perth and Kinross. Both were flatly wrong.
Kezia Dugdale. Ms Dugdale.
She's trying to deny that there's cuts in education, and we've seen 4,000.
Order. Let's hear Ms Dugdale.
4,000 fewer teachers in this country since she came to office. She can't reprofile that away. Now, she didn't like hearing the truth from Unite. Let's see what she has to say about the GMB. Here's Gary Smith, Secretary of the GMB in Scotland. Representing public sector workers, don't forget that, First Minister. Government ministers need to take their heads out of the sand about the devastating impact of the cuts they are making on essential local services right across Scotland. That, First Minister, is the reality. Now, Nicola Sturgeon is the first to line up to set up task forces and summits when jobs disappear in the private sector. But when teachers and classroom assistants and office staff find themselves out of work because of choices she has made, she's nowhere to be seen. This afternoon, the SNP-controlled Dundee City Council will vote on plans to cut the budget for supply teachers, on plans to close a high school, on plans to cut the budget for classroom materials. For a decade, the First Minister has told us that more powers would mean fewer cuts. Yet when she had the chance to use the powers of this Parliament to stop cuts to schools and save jobs, she bottled it with her austerity budget. So how many jobs need to be lost and how many cuts need to be made before this First Minister will finally use the powers she has?
First Minister.
I think, given that I have already demonstrated that what Kezia Dugdale said 2 weeks about Perth and Kinross was wrong, what she said yesterday about Clackmannanshire was wrong, then I think people should take what she's saying today about Dundee with a pinch of salt. But it's interesting, isn't it, that Kezia Dugdale stands here and complains about a reduction in the number of teachers, and yet yesterday in this chamber, she joined forces with the Conservatives to vote against a budget that expressly maintains the number of teachers. That is the blatant hypocrisy of Labour in this chamber. But Kezia Dugdale likes to quote people. Well, let me quote a couple of her own colleagues. How about the Labour leader of East Lothian Council? He should be familiar to Ian Gray. This is what he said earlier this month. Our budget will enable us to invest in the future through increased provision for education and promoting the local economy. Or we could have the Labour leader of West Lothian Council. We have a budget that focuses on and meets the needs of local people while protecting services that impact on the most vulnerable. Or we could go to Aberdeen. Aberdeen, the Labour leader, actually, yes, in Aberdeen, has today joined forces with the Conservatives to issue a letter to every council taxpayer in Aberdeen. That letter says that John Swinney's budget is so dreadful that it has enabled Aberdeen City Council, and I'm quoting from the letter, to protect frontline services and jobs for the people of Aberdeen and progress an ambitious and comprehensive plan which supports education, new infrastructure, roads, culture and prevention against flooding. Terrible John Swinney enabling a council to do all of that.
Kezia Dugdale. Ms Dugdale. Order. Ms Dugdale.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister might like to remember that the Green Party, those notable right-wingers at the back of the chamber there, also voted against her budget yesterday. And I tell you what I voted against. I voted against cuts to jobs, cuts to schools and cuts to local services. No politician can be taken seriously about wanting to tackle poverty and inequality unless they are prepared to challenge the current Westminster model of austerity. Not my words, the words of Nicola Sturgeon. But her budget used this Parliament as a conveyor belt for Westminster austerity yesterday. and we were faced with a choice between using the powers of this Parliament to invest in the future or to impose more cuts on vital public services. So when she knows thousands of jobs will be lost, and she knows the impact this will have on generations of young people, why on earth did she choose more cuts?
First Minister.
Not only does Kezia Dugdale's claims not bear any resemblance to reality, I have debunked most of the claims she's made through reference to the reality in Perth and Kinross, in Clackmannanshire and in Aberdeen City Council. But let me just outline to Kezia Dugdale exactly what she did join with the Conservatives to vote against yesterday. She and her colleagues, arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder with the Tories, voted against record funding for the National Health Service. They voted against the doubling of the Education Attainment Fund. They voted against increased funding for social care services. They voted against the protection of the police budget in real terms. They voted against the protection for apprenticeships. And perhaps most galling of all, given everything Labour's had to say on this issue over the past couple of years, Labour MSPs joined with the Conservatives to vote against a living wage for care workers. There's been a lot of quotes thrown about this chamber today, Presiding Officer. Let me just end with this one. It's from Kezia Dugdale herself. When asked this week, will you come second in the Scottish Parliament elections, Kezia Dugdale said yes, and I think we've just seen why.
Question 2. Order. Question 2. Ruth Davidson. Ms Davidson.
And I think even that may be in doubt. To ask the First Minister when she'll next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans at present.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, I would like to return to the growing crisis affecting our rural economy that's been caused by this SNP government. Yesterday, I received an email from Jim Walker, the former head of the National Farmers Union of Scotland. And in it, he told me that he may have supported independence, but, and I quote, he could never support a party, a minister or a government that have been quite so incompetent and frankly naive. He's writing an article to be published tomorrow in which he says that the NFUS should call for the resignation of both the Cabinet Secretary and his Director in the Civil Service. Here are the facts, Presiding Officer. Our rural economy is currently being starved of £500 million worth of funding because this SNP government couldn't organise a payment system in time. A system which has already run £75 million over budget and still doesn't work. What is it going to take for this First Minister to get a grip?
First Minister.
Firstly, it might be worth just pointing out that in the most recent CAP negotiations, the Conservative Party actually argued for the scrapping of the direct support for Scottish and UK farmers that we're talking about today. So that's perhaps just a contextual point that is worth bearing in mind. But this is obviously a very important and serious issue, Presiding Officer. We are continuing to do everything possible to get instalments out to as many farmers as we can by the end of March, and the balance of payments as soon as possible after that. The number, as Richard Lochhead said in portfolio questions yesterday, is now approaching 50%. We are reporting progress weekly to the RACI committee and to industry and are in fortnightly discussions with banks to discuss the situation. And, of course, Richard Lochhead, when he spoke to the NFU, announced a £20 million hardship scheme so that any farmer who hasn't had their payment and is not getting support for their bank can apply for hardship payments from the Scottish Government. It's interesting, perhaps, to reflect on what the Chief Executive of the Scottish Crofting Federation said about that. It's heartening to see the Scottish Government dealing with these challenging circumstances in such a creative way, and the idea of the Government being a lender, while not new, shows that they are doing everything they can to address the difficult situation. We are doing everything we can, Presiding Officer, and we will continue to do so.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, the payments were supposed to be made by December and it's now nearly March. Only the SNP could take that sort of a failure and try and claim it's some kind of success. I mean, I heard what the First Minister said there, but the truth is, if this was affecting urban Scotland or the Central Belt, then the SNP would be all over it. But because it affects rural Scotland and the borders, it slipped off her radar. Let's be clear about this. This is a complete failure of government. It is damaging people's livelihoods. It's now cost the taxpayer half of what it cost to build this Parliament building, and it's still not fixed. Jim Walker speaks for thousands of farmers and crofters who are looking for some action. It's clear that the Cabinet Secretary is part of the problem, not the solution. So isn't it time the First Minister stepped in and took personal charge of ensuring that our rural economy is led out of this crisis?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I said to Ruth Davidson 2 weeks ago, the Cabinet has been discussing this matter on a weekly basis. But Ruth Davidson has just said something in her question there that is factually inaccurate. The EU payment window for these payments is the 1st of December 2015 to the end of June 2016. The deadline for payments is actually the 30th of June 2016. That is the reality. She also talks a load of nonsense about the costs of the IT system and says it costs half of what this Parliament costs. That is an IT system to cover the entire 7-year programme of the CAP, and efforts are being made to ensure that it is supporting these payments. So we will continue to take the responsible action of making sure we get payments to farmers as quickly as possible, but also making sure we've got the arrangements in place through the hardship fund that I've spoken about to ensure that any farmer who doesn't have their payment or who cannot get support from their bank can come to the government for that support. I think that's the right way to deal with what is a difficult situation, and we will continue to do so.
Question number 3, Linda Fabiani.
To ask the First Minister what progress there has been on the fiscal framework negotiations.
First Minister.
Good progress. As I reported to Parliament on Tuesday, there is now an agreement in principle that I think we can recommend to Parliament. Draft heads of agreement will be published by the end of this week. The agreement we have reached on the block grant adjustment ensures there is no detriment for the next 6 years and that there can be no default by the UK Government after that to a funding model that would deliver detriment. In other words, this deal will not allow a single pound or penny to be taken from our budget. It will ensure that the funding for Scotland can't be changed without our agreement. It protects the Barnett formula and will allow new powers to be delivered.
Linda Fabiani.
The First Minister is, of course, aware that when the Deputy First Minister and I served in the Smith Commission, we achieved unanimous agreement that the Scottish Government and the UK Government were equal partners in terms of any negotiations. Can the First Minister confirm that this parity of esteem was respected during the fiscal framework negotiations just completed and will be maintained? Does the First Minister agree that equal partnership in entering any negotiation is absolutely crucial to protect Scotland's future interests?
First Minister.
I believe that's absolutely vital. It was that parity of esteem and equal partnership that meant we were able to resist an attempt by the Treasury to cut our budget by £7 billion. If we hadn't had that, then the Treasury would have been able to impose that. So the equal partnership meant that John Swinney's superior negotiating skills could come to the fore and protect Scotland's budget. But Linda Fabiani raises a serious point about the future, because not only did that equal partnership allow us to protect Scotland's budget, making sure that that equal partnership and requirement for joint agreement is built into the arrangements for the review after the first 5 years will be essential to making sure that then we can also protect Scotland's budget, and that's exactly what we will intend to do.
Gavin Brown.
It was rightly welcomed on all sides. One part of the agreement, though, was getting the Fiscal Commission to do the official tax forecast, and this is a vital step forward. Will the First Minister work with me to convince her backbenchers that this is the way to go?
First Minister.
The very thought of working with Gavin Brown is bringing me out in a cold sweat, but I'll try to get over that. On a serious matter, I said on Tuesday that we've had to give and take in these negotiations, and I think that should be welcomed as part and parcel of a mature negotiation. And one of the areas where John Swinney has made a concession and agreed to is around the arrangements for the Fiscal Commission. I know John Swinney has already given some detail of that, and more detail of that will be in the Heads of Agreement when they're published before the end of this week. But overall, this is a good deal and a deal that I think everybody across the Parliament should welcome.
Malcolm Chisholm.
Congratulations to the Deputy First Minister and to herself on this. But in her statement on Tuesday, she said the block grant adjustment would be based on an annual adjustment to a Treasury methodology, which now appears to be tax capacity adjusted levels deduction. So is she absolutely certain that a annual population adjustment to that methodology will produce the same result as per capita indexation?
First Minister.
Well, yes, and that is absolutely critical to the agreement. And when the heads of terms are published, Malcolm Chisholm and everybody else will see that what we've agreed to is a method of making the block grant adjustment that is required over that transitional period to deliver the same outcome as per capita index deduction, and that is absolutely crucial. Can I take the opportunity to thank Malcolm Chisholm for his support on this issue? I think even before the official Labour position was to support the position of the Scottish Government, Malcolm Chisholm was steadfast in saying that the Scottish Government's position was correct, and that, and the support of the STUC, for example, and many others, was really helpful in getting to the agreement that we struck on Tuesday. So I would accord Malcolm Chisholm my thanks for that.
Question number 4. Doris.
To ask the First Minister what progress the Scottish Government is making in reducing A&E waiting times.
First Minister.
The latest published monthly performance for December shows that A&E performance across Scotland was the highest level we've seen in any December since 2009 and is the best performing country across the UK. For core sites in December, A&E waiting time performance was 94.5% in Scotland compared to 86.6% in England, 76.9% in Wales and 70.9% in Northern Ireland. However, there's still more to do to ensure continued progress in A&E performance in Scotland. That's why we launched the 6 Essential Actions approach in May last year. That's a 2-year programme that aims to minimise long waits in A&E and assessment units by improving patient flow throughout all areas of the hospital and back into the community. We've also provided additional £10.7 million winter funding to support boards through winter pressures.
Bob Doris.
Thank you, First Minister. I'm sure the Parliament would like to thank NHS staff for their hard work and dedication for the impressive improvement that we've seen in waiting times, of course boosted by a 178% increase in the level of A&E consultants under this Scottish Government. With Scottish A&E performances now clearly the best in the UK, comparing favourably with Labour-run Wales, and an English NHS where its Tory Health Minister is too busy picking fights with junior doctors, does the First Minister agree with me that taking a partnership approach as opposed to conflict with health professionals is key to building that success? And would the First Minister also welcome health professionals from elsewhere in the UK should they wish to make a positive choice and bring their skills to the Scottish NHS?
First Minister.
Well, I would certainly welcome health professionals from anywhere who want to come to work in Scotland. But Bob Doris raises important points, and they'll be important to patients across the country. We've got work to do in A&E, and I wouldn't for a second stand here and say that it was job done. But there are 2 things that I think should give us encouragement. Firstly, our A&E waiting times, I think almost week for week at the moment, are better than in the same period last year. But relative to the other nations of the UK, our A&E departments are performing much more strongly. So that's good and positive news, but we will not be complacent at all, and we'll continue to work with health professionals to make sure we improve performance even further.
Jim Hume.
I'm glad the First Minister mentioned not being complacent, because last week saw the worst A&E performance in Scotland since weekly stats began. 1 in 10 not treated within 4 hours. Only 4 health boards met their targets. Can the First Minister explain why, and can she promise to support our local and hard-working NHS staff?
First Minister.
Well, figures will fluctuate week on week, and there will be a variety of reasons in different hospitals why that's the case, and I think everybody will understand that. But Jim Hume talks about the most recent weekly performance, which incidentally saw 9 out of 10 patients across our A&E departments treated within 4 hours. But that weekly performance, although it was lower than we would have wanted it to be, obviously, is nevertheless 3 percentage points better than it was in the same week last year. So that underlines the point I'm making. We're seeing consistent improvement compared in each week compared to the same week in the previous year, and that's good. And as I say, our accident emergency units are performing much better than any other nation in the UK. Now, I'm standing here giving that information, but that is entirely down to the hard work and dedication of those who work in our accident emergency units, and it's probably an appropriate moment again for me today to thank them for all the work that they do.
Richard Simpson.
Of course, we all thank the staff for their hard work. The First Minister mentioned immediate assessment units. My FOI has shown that there are 30 of these units now, 15 different names, no common protocol, no monitoring, no reporting, and targets, unlike A&E, range from the 4-hour target to none. And Greater Glasgow and Clyde reported that patients could expect to wait, and I quote, 12 hours. There have been 115 deaths in these units. This is the alternative doorway to A&E getting in. A&E stats only mean something if we actually combine these two. What progress is she and the Cabinet Secretary making in actually ensuring that there are proper protocols on these units so that we can actually see transparent figures in relation to admissions?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, the immediate assessment units, many of which were established under the last Labour administration, which is a good thing, are different from A&E units, and that's why they're treated differently. Patients often receive treatment in these units, not just the tests and monitoring they would receive elsewhere. But guidance to boards, and this is important, guidance to boards is that patients on trolleys awaiting admission in an assessment unit are monitored against the 4-hour A&E target until they're admitted to a bed or to a dedicated area. And we're also working with the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh to share best practice across the different assessment units, including sharing information on monitoring. And we'll be considering with the Royal College whether assessment units should be subject to further common standards. Now, Richard Simpson raised the important issue of deaths in hospital, and I don't seek to underplay that point at all. But I think, again, for context, it is worth pointing out that hospital mortality rates are now at their lowest level in Scotland since records began. They've dropped 16.5% since 2007. Another example of the excellent work that our health professionals do around the country.
Question number 5, Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the impact of the local authority budget settlement on nursery education.
First Minister.
Within the financial settlement for local government, we are funding the additional cost of early learning and childcare provisions under the Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014. This includes the expansion to 600 hours and extension to over a quarter of 2-year-olds. So far, we've provided £329 million to fund this expansion and have committed a further £170 million in the 2016-17 budget. That covers the first 3 years of the expansion from August 2014, and we've committed to continue increasing revenue funding year on year until 2019-20 to enable local authorities to provide more choice and flexibility. I actually will be meeting local government leaders and key partners this afternoon at the Early Learning and Childcare Summit to discuss how we will continue to work together to deliver these commitments.
Ken McIntosh.
Can I thank the First Minister for that information? And she will know, Presiding Officer, that earlier this month the EIS revealed that in the 9 years of SNP government, the number of teachers in Scotland's nurseries has fallen by a quarter. So I think many of us were both intrigued and encouraged by her pledge at the weekend to increase the number of nursery teachers. I encouraged clearly, but intrigued because when Ms Sturgeon was first elected in 2007, she said in her manifesto, and I quote, "We are concerned at the removal of nursery teachers from nurseries," and she pledged to maintain teacher numbers. Can I ask her, what's changed? Did she not mean her promise then but means it now, or does she have some other explanation?
First Minister.
The registered child daycare workforce has increased by 7%, and the announcement that Ken McIntosh refers to from the weekend, I don't know whether he just missed it. I actually made that announcement back in October last year, where, as part of our efforts to make sure that we're tackling the attainment gap, I've given a commitment that all nurseries in deprived areas will have an additional teacher or graduate with early learning and childcare expertise working with young children. And that's an important commitment as we try to make sure that we use not just the expansion in quantity of childcare, but also improve the quality of childcare to make sure that we're giving every young person the best start in life.
6, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what discussions the Scottish Government has had about the relationship between Prestwick Airport and the Trump Organisation.
First Minister.
Well, Prestwick Airport operates on a commercial basis. The Scottish Government has had no discussions on the relationship between Prestwick Airport and the Trump Organisation. The senior management team at the airport are responsible for developing business opportunities, and we expect them to work closely with local businesses to explore all avenues. And I was very pleased to hear Ryanair's announcement on Tuesday that it will introduce 3 new routes for winter 2016 and increase passenger numbers at Prestwick by 75,000.
Patrick Harvie.
It's been clear for many years to anyone who cared to take an interest that Donald Trump was an arrogant and racist bully. And I had thought that when Nicola Sturgeon took the decision to rightly kick him out of the Global Scot network, the Scottish Government had come to regret ever having courted his business. But now it appears that Prestwick Airport, publicly owned by the Scottish Government, is pursuing an official partnership, a strategic alliance with the Trump organisation. Doesn't the First Minister agree that any owner of any business, but most particularly a government that exists to serve the public interest, must ensure that the business it owns cuts ties with such a dangerous extremist? Will the First Minister agree with that?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, while I would probably use more diplomatic language, I suspect my views and Patrick Harvie's views and Donald Trump are not that materially different. But it's important here to be very clear. There is no contractual relationship between Prestwick Airport and Donald Trump or any of his organisations, including Trump Turnberry. But in terms of the operation of Glasgow Prestwick Airport, European Union state aid rules require that airport to be operated on a wholly commercial basis at arm's length from the Scottish Government. We are not permitted to intervene in the commercial discussions of the airport. Now, we brought that airport into state ownership to save it from closure. It is making progress. The management there, as I've just said in relation to the Ryanair announcement, are making progress in getting that airport onto a better footing, and I think we should get behind them as they continue to make those efforts.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.